Shabna. X1 is current at, in the present of, during, concurrent, or simultaneous with X2 in time. Shabra. X1 is an apparatus, mechanism, device, or equipment for function X2 controlled or triggered by X3. Shashra. X1 is X2 hours in duration by standard X3. Shadzu. X1 walks, strides, or paces on surface X2 using limbs X3. Shafne. X1 often, frequently, commonly, or customarily occurs or recurs by standard X2. Shakla. X1 is made of, contains, or is a quantity of chocolate or cocoa. Shalku. X1 is a shell or husk around X2 composed of X3. Shanshi. X1 vanishes or disappears from location X2. X1 ceases to be observed at X2 using senses or sensor X3. Shando. X1 is idle, at rest, or inactive. Shunge. X1 is a farm or ranch at X2, farmed by X3, raising or producing X4. X1 is agrarian. Shanja. X1 exchanges, trades, or barters commodity X2 for X3 with X4. X1 and X4 are traders, merchants, or businessmen. Shanko. X1 is a window, portal, or opening in wall, building, or structure X2. Shanlu. X1 is space, volume, region, or room occupied by X2. Shanpa. X1 is a shovel or spade for digging X2. Shanre. X1 is a quantity of, contains, or is made of sand or grit from source X2 of composition including X3. Shanti. X1 are the guts, entrails, intestines, viscera, innards, or digestive system of X2. Sharshe. X1 is a cart, carriage, or wagon for carrying X2 propelled by X3. Sharmi. X1 is intense, bright, saturated, or brilliant in property X2 as received or measured by observer X3. Sharna. X1 turns about vector X2 towards direction X3, turning angular distance or to face point X4. Shartu. X1 is a chart, diagram, or map of or about X2 showing formation or data points X3. Sharvi. X1 rains, showers, or precipitates to X2 from X3. X1 is precipitation. Shasnu. X1 discusses or talks about topic or subject X2. Shatke. X1 shoves or pushes X2 at locus X3. Shatlu. X1 looks at, examines, views, inspects, regards, watches, or gazes at X2. Shutni. X1 has authority or is an official in, on, or over matter, sphere, or persons X2, derived on basis X3. Shatra. X1 kills, slaughters, or murders X2 by action or method X3. Shachno. X1 is shallow in extent in direction or property X2 away from reference point X3 by standard X4. Sheshla. X1 launches, fires, or shoots projectile or missile X2 propelled by X3. Sheshmu. X1 is a community or colony of organisms X2. Sheshra. X1 is an era, epoch, or age characterized by X2. Shenba. X1 varies or changes in property or quantity X2 and amount or degree X3 under conditions X4. Shensa. x1 is holy or sacred to person, people, culture, religion, cult, or group x2. Shinti. x1 is a hundredth of x2 in dimension or aspect x3. Sherda. x1 is an heir to or is to inherit x2 from x3 according to rule x4. Sherni. x1 is a morning of day x2 at location x3. Shertu. x1 is an expert, pro, or has prowess in or is skilled at x2 by standard x3. Shevni. x1 is a god or deity of people or religion x2 with dominion over x3. x1 is divine. Shvari. x1 commences, initiates, starts, or begins to occur. Shvika. x1 is a work of fiction about plot, theme, or subject x2 or under convention x2 by author x3. Shvila. x1 is a flaw, fault, or defect in x2 causing x3. Shvina. x1 is a wedge of material x2. Shvipu. x1 confuses or baffles x2 due to property x3. Shiblu. x1 is blood or vital fluid of organism x2. Shishna. x1 is cyan, turquoise, or greenish blue. Shija. x1 is food, feed, or nutriment for x2. x1 is edible or gives nutrition to x2. Shidni. x1 is a knee, elbow, or knuckle of limb x2 of body x3. Shidro. x1 is a quantity of, contains, or is made of hydrogen. Shifnu. x1 is an infant or baby of species x2. Shigla. x1 is a gland secreting x2 of body x3. x2 is a secretion of x1. Shikna. x1 is awake, alert, or conscious. Shikra. x1 repairs, mends, or fixes x2 for use x3. Shiksi. x1 explains x2 to x3 with explanation x4. Shilshe. x1 is wild or untamed. Shilmo. x1 is moist, wet, or damp with liquid x2. Shilre. x1 learns x2 about subject x3 from source x4 by method x5. Shilta. x1 is a thread, filament, or wire of material x2. Shimde. x1 is a dimension of space or object x2 according to rules or model x3. Shimni. x1 is infinite, unending, or eternal in property or dimension x2 to degree x3 or of type x3. Shinba. x1 kisses or busses x2 at locus x3. Shindu. x1 is an oak, a type of tree, of species or strain x2. Shinfo. x1 is a lion or lioness of species or breed x2. Shinje. x1 is a wrinkle, crease, or fold in x2. Shinki. x1 is an insect or arthropod of species x2. Shinla. x1 is thin in direction or dimension x2 by standard x3. Shinmo. x1 feels emotion x2 about x3. Shinri. x1 interests or is interesting to x2. x2 is interested in x1. Shinse. x1 in activity or state x2 exhibits sexuality, gender, or sexual orientation x3 by standard x4. cinta. X1 is a paint of pigment or active substance X2 and a base of X3. Cinza. X1 are tongs, chopsticks, pinchers, tweezers, or pliers for X2 to pinch X3. Sheepney. X1 is a bird, avian, or fowl of species X2. Sheepra. X1 is a test for or proof of property or state X2 in subject X3. Shirko. X1 loses person or thing X2 at or near X3. X1 loses property or feature X2 in conditions or situation X3. Shirla. X1 is a quantity of or contains cheese or curd from source X2. Ciska. X1 inscribes or writes X2 on display or storage medium X3 with writing implement X4. X1 is a scribe. Shisma. X1 smiles or grins. Shiste. X1 is a system interrelated by structure X2 among components X3, displaying X4. Shitka. X1 eats, ingests, or consumes X2. Shitno. X1 is young or youthful by standard X2. Shivla. X1 is a louse or flea of species or breed X2, parasitic on X3. Shitri. X1 is a history of X2 according to X3 or from point of view X3. Shitsi. X1 is a season or is seasonal, defined by interval or property X2 of year X3. Shizra. X1 is strange, weird, deviant, bizarre, or odd to X2 in property X3. Shkabu. X1 is a quantity of, contains, or is made of rubber or latex from source X2 of composition including X3. Shkafi. X1 is made of, contains, or is a quantity of coffee from source bean or grain X2. Shkaji. X1 has or is characterized by property, feature, trait, aspect, or dimension X2. X2 is manifest in X1. Shkana. X1 is a bed or pallet of material X2 for holding or supporting X3. Shkape. X1 is perilous, dangerous, or potentially harmful to X2 under conditions X3. Shkasu. X1 ridicules, mocks, or scoffs at X2 about X3 by doing activity X4. Shkeji. X1 feels ashamed, mortified, or humiliated under conditions X2 before community or audience X3. Shkiku. X1 is a key, fitting, releasing, opening, or unlocking lock X2 and having relevant properties X3. Shkilu. X1 is a scale of units for measuring, observing, or determining X2. Shkini. X1 is related to, associated with, or akin to X2 by relationship X3. Shkira. X1 is grateful, thankful to, or appreciative of X2 for X3. Shkula. X1 is a school, institute, or academy at X2 teaching subjects X3 to audience or community X4 operated by X5. Shkunu. X1 is a conifer, pine, or fir of species or strain X2 with cones X3. Shladu. X1 is loud or noisy at observation point X2 by standard X3. Shlani. X1 is long in dimension or direction X2 by measurement standard X3. Shlachu. X1 is without, lacking, free of, or lacks X2. X1 is X2-less. Shlika. X1 is moss or lichen of species or strain X2 growing on x3. x1 is mossy. Schlira. x1 is early by standard x2. Schlita. x1 is polite, courteous, or civil in matter x2 according to standard or custom x3. Schliba. x1 leaves, goes away, departs, parts, or separates from x2 via route x3. Schlupa. x1 is a loop or circuit of x2. Schmashi. x1 is a mathematics of type or describing x2. Schmalu. x1 is small in property or dimension x2 as compared with standard or norm x3. Shmana. x1 is a mountain, hill, mound, rise, peak, summit, or highlands projecting from landmass x2. Shmavo. x1 is a structure word of grammatical class x2 with meaning or function x3 and usage x4. Shmena. x1 is a name, title, or tag of x2 to or used by namer or name user x3. Shmila. x1 laughs. Shmima. x1 is a member or element of set x2. x1 belongs to group x2. x1 is amid, among, or amongst group x2. Shmoni. x1 utters moan, groan, howl, or scream x2 expressing x3. Shnano. x1 is a norm or average in property or amount x2 among x3 by standard x4. Schnebel. x1 is a neck of x2. Schnemu. x1 rewards x2 for atypical x3 with reward or deserts x4. Shnishi. x1 is orderly, neat, or ordered in property or quantity x2. Shnino. x1 is new, unfamiliar, or novel to observer x2 in feature x3 by standard x4. x1 is a novelty. Shnisa. x1 is a quantity of, contains, or is made of lead. Shnita. x1 is directly or vertically beneath, below, under, underneath, or down from x2 in frame of reference x3. Shokshu. x1 soaks up, absorbs, or sucks up x2 from x3 into x4. x1 is an absorbent. Shundi. x1 is deep in extent and direction or property x2 away from reference point x3 by standard x4. Shortu. x1 hurts or feels pain or hurt at locus x2. Shpashu. x1 gets, procures, acquires, obtains, or accepts x2 from source x3. Shpana. x1 is upon, atop, resting on, or lying on x2 in frame of reference or gravity x3. Shpare. x1 climbs, clambers, creeps, or crawls on surface x2 in direction x3 using x4. Shperu. x1 requests, asks, petitions, or solicits for x2 of or from x3 in manner or form x4. Shpina. x1 is pungent, piquant, peppery, spicy, or irritating to sense x2. Shrati. x1 broadcasts or transmits x2 via station or frequency x3 to receiver x4. Shrana. x1 is interior, ahead, forward, or to the front of x2, which faces or in frame of reference x3. Shreka. x1 is a shirt, blouse, or top of material x2. Shrepu. x1 harvests, reaps, or gathers crop, product, or objects x2 from source or area x3. Shribe. x1 is a bear or ursoid of species or breed x2. Shwida. X1 is a fairy, elf, gnome, brownie, pixie, goblin, or kobold of mythos or religion X2. Shrino. X1 is green or verdant. Shripu. X1 is a bridge or span over or across X2 between X3 and X4. Shrisa. X1 is summer or summertime of year X2 at location X3. Shritu. X1 is autumn or fall of year X2 at location X3. Shtaru. X1 is a tide in X2 caused by X3. Shtebi. X1 is a lip of orifice X2 of body X3. X1 is labial. Shteki. X1 is a tax, levy, or duty on goods, services, or event X2 levied against X3 by authority or collector X4. Shtila. X1 is a quantity of petroleum or oil from source X2. Shtino. X1 is a shadow or the shade of object X2 made by light or energy source X3. Shtusha. X1 teaches audience X2 ideas, methods, or lore X3 about subject X4 by method X5. Shukla. X1 is round or circular. X1 is a disk, circle, or ring. Shukta. X1 is a book containing work X2 by author X3 for audience X4 preserved in medium X5. Shulno. X1 is full or completely filled with X2. Shumki. X1 is possible under conditions X2. X1 may or might occur. X1 is a maybe. Shumla. X1 is humble or modest about X2. X1 displays humility about X2. Shunmi. X1 is a quantity of millet of species or strain X2. Shunso. X1 is random, fortuitous, or unpredictable under conditions X2 with probability distribution X3. Shuntu. X1 is an affair or organized activity involving persons X2. X1 is X2's business. Shupra. X1 produces X2 by process X3. Shurmi. X1 lets, permits, or allows X2 under conditions X3. X1 grants privilege X2. Shurnu. X1 is a worm or invertebrate animal of species or breed X2. Shurve. X1 is pure, unadulterated, unmitigated, or simple in property X2. Shusku. X1 expresses or says X2 for audience X3 via expressive medium X4. Shuchi. X1 is a shoe, boot, or sandal for covering or protecting X2 and of material X3. Shutna. X1 is a chest, thorax, upper trunk, rib cage, or breast of X2. Shuchna. X1 chooses or selects X2 from set or sequence of alternatives X3.